Hi everyone, welcome back to Project No Buy. It is time for this video, the problem with influencers. And I have been approaching this for some time, and perhaps kind of coming at it from various angles for the whole duration of the 2 years, or maybe a year and a half. I kind of started this critical thinking about influencers and influencing maybe halfway through 2024. I've been at odds with how to approach this because there are multiple levels, I guess, of influencing in the first place, and multiple kind of aspects that are problematic, and also multiple levels of intentional compliance with all of these problems, I guess, or all of these issues. And so I invite you to take all of this with a light touch and not necessarily take anything too seriously unless you want to, unless you think it demands to be taken seriously. And I'm going to leave that up to you. I am not demanding that any of this be taken as the gospel or as seriously or as, this isn't one of those, this is a problem videos. This is like, I think this is a problem kind of videos. So with that caveat out of the way, I do feel like society is coming to a collective agreement that influencing can be bad, or at least my sector of society is kind of on the same page about how influencing can very much be problematic. And there are various perspectives that I've seen people talking about as well. A lot of these will be shared by creators in the list of videos that inspire me for this No Buy year, 2025, so I'll pin that list up here. And we'll get into my perspectives, I guess, shortly. So I was initially approaching this whole idea with the influencers are unethical kind of lens. But now I think to frame it like that would be a little bit unfair, given that influencers themselves are not in control of the whole system and not the engineers of its problems. But they are participating, and some of them are making a very good living off of their participation. And then when that happens, when people are making a good living, it does kind of tip into an issue of what kind of responsibilities there are for people doing well for themselves based off of some form of exploitation of other people, which again is common to all industries, right? It's not just an influencer problem. They bring themselves closer and closer to being part of the rich stratosphere of the eat the rich. And they do reach a point where they certainly could choose to do otherwise. They could stop influencing and just go live a happy and peaceful life. And so, there are various tipping points where it's varying degrees of unethical, perhaps. So, as with everything, this kind of has to begin with that overarching question of what is capitalism, the system in which we live that allows for any of this to happen in the first place, and then explore how influencers support, enable, and encourage or grow the power of this current system. So capitalism is often characterized as being the free markets or the most free markets system, which is how I used to think about it as well. And after reading Vulture Capitalism and currently working on even more books that are about this, although I will reserve judgment until I've gotten a little bit more into them, I have learned that it is not, in fact, a totally free market, and it does, in fact, depend on planning and allocation of resources and kind of division of resources, rather, from the people who own the capital and those who work for the people who own it. And those who own the means of capital, the means of production, have the ability to plan and enact change on the market, and those who do not don't have these abilities. So the system depends on this division existing and being perpetuated, right? The class of owners versus the class of workers. And this in itself is maybe not inherently bad, but then there are kind of negative factors that emerge, like monopolies. When companies become more successful and find that the best way to compete with their competition is by not competing and acquiring, buying them up or putting them out of business in other ways. There are also kind of other negative aspects of the system that are encouraged and perpetuated, like the exploitation of workers, like the pursuit of cheaper and cheaper labor, like the outsourcing of this labor whenever possible. And so, I've discussed many of these downsides at length, both through the lens of capitalism and through the lens of just being an observer without the education about the system. And, basically, we can all point to disasters like the Rana Plaza collapse, the factories in Bangladesh that were unsafe for workers, and say that that's bad and shouldn't happen and the industry should be regulated. And then we can also look at that through the lens of capitalism and say, well, of course that was going to happen because the nature of capitalism pushes companies to compete for the most profit value because of their shareholders, not even because of the company's own health and success. And so nobody is really free to have a company that's self-sustaining, and everybody has to be optimizing for growth, constantly, and even bigger representations of success. And so it's kind of like everybody's hands are tied until regulation steps in. And, how is that going to happen? Anyway, this is not that video of trying to unpack that, but it is kind of coupled hand in hand, and I don't want to miss any aspects of that nuance in terms of the system being a problem. And so there we go. With that out of the way, influencers are basically the biggest pick-me's of this system, where by trying to serve the capital owners and basically design their own businesses, their own brands for optimization in terms of being able to work with the most capital owners, the most companies, and be willing to market products to those who don't need them, market them in a way that creates that need by showing it as aspirational, by presenting their whole lives as aspirational, by sharing enough of themselves to be relatable, but also show that next level of comparison, to make the average viewer feel poor. A lot of the comments in social media hauls, restocks, videos of this nature will say, oh, you just called me poor in 10 different languages. Oh, my bed just asked if we're poor. And that's one of the lies I talked about believing in my previous video, as far as lies that kept me consuming and aspiring for more, kept me looking for that next level and believing that once I attained it, I would feel rich, or I would feel not poor. I would feel secure. I would feel what I was supposed to feel. There would be a kind of resting point where I had enough. And feeling enough is not dependent on how much stuff you have. And we can know this without actually feeling it, if that makes sense. A lot of what I talk about on this channel is things that we know, and we, I mean me in this case, but we as humanity, we know broadly that you can't buy happiness, but we sure get marketing that makes us want to believe that we could buy it. And for a moment, especially for the more impulsive among us, we might actually try to do it. We might actually keep trying to do it for a long time until we decide to do an O by year and get off of that dopamine cycle and all that. We might even get into examining dopamine. It's the feedback loop of why buying things gives us that temporary happiness. But then that still doesn't solve the problem of knowing that we can't buy happiness and trying to find an alternative route to access that while trying to extricate ourselves from all the noise that tells us that buying stuff, even though it won't lead to happiness, it will lead to a little bit of happiness in that moment. So anyway, influencers, they're the pick-me's of the system. They want to work with the capital owners, they want to show their lives as aspirational, and they are not in a position to invite critical thinking about what they're doing, what they're showing, what they want you to do, what they want you to buy. And what they want to show you, what they want you to buy, is not for the sake of the capital owners above them. It's for their own sakes. It's for the sake of their own living, their own lifestyle as an influencer. And not all influencers are making big bucks. Some of them are making a reasonable salary. Some of them are making even less. And it's that human self-interest, I guess, that makes it acceptable in a way, right? Like everybody has to do a job for money, or most people on this planet will have to be a laborer or worker in some way. And so it's that aspect of it that is acceptable, but even in that realm of acceptability in terms of doing a job to make enough money to survive, they are still functioning as the pick-me's of the capitalist system. And that is something that is problematic. And in their efforts to kind of not invite critical thinking, again, not saying they're doing that on purpose, but the nature of their content is not open to critical thinking. It's not pointing us in the direction of critical thinking. Even if the comments are, they don't typically engage with that in a genuine way. It's typically brushed under the rug or girl math, or it's not that deep. That's kind of the way those comments manifest and the way they're responded to. So I think it's fair to say broadly that influencing content and that life job path, that path of employment or self-employment or whatever, is not furthering the development of society. It's kind of keeping things where they are, keeping things percolating on this level, and kind of generating support for this way of capitalism in that attention, in getting the eyeballs on this type of content, on this mentality, making people aspire towards this mentality, and even this career of being an influencer, being a pick-me for the companies, being the kind of person that could work with all of these advertisers, that could be an advertiser for all of these companies, for all these products. And again, it's not entirely their fault. There's been a long movement, again, evidenced by Naomi Klein's No Logo, which was written few decades ago, and how work has been moving towards more contracted labor and less salaried labor, less salaries with benefits basically, and more self-employed contracts. And the job of influencing positions this as a positive thing. And oftentimes, especially the most successful examples of this, which will be the most popular examples of this, will make other people aspire to this level of perceived freedom, perceived control, perceived ability to make uncapped amounts of personal wealth. And it's not the most responsible narrative as long as our society remains the way it is and is very individualistic, again, speaking for American culture, and lacks social safety nets. The more employed you are, the more salary and benefits you get from your company, the more safety net you have. It's not necessarily positive to be promoting a lifestyle that glorifies the lack of social safety nets, lacks the responsibility of companies to take care of their employees when we live in the society in which we live. And again, Naomi Klein talks about that, how contracted work was presented as a positive thing, and how there are real benefits that do exist with contracted work that doesn't negate the responsibility of employers to provide benefits for their employees. Companies should not be allowed to shirk the responsibilities of providing these benefits through contracted labor, through temp jobs, through pursuing people who have no choice but to take this kind of work, and therefore getting around the real measures that would take the best care of the people under their care in the terms of providing their livelihoods. I guess that's another thing where I feel like we've been conditioned to not view companies as people who are supposed to take care of us. There's this kind of atmosphere of being against management, and that is the reality. We do have to take care of ourselves. But the other reality is any company that pays our living wages is taking care of us in that way, and should be looked at as, the relationship between employer and employee is a complex one and should maybe be different than it is. If an employee's salary is what gives us our livelihoods, our literal livelihoods, we survive because of the money we get from these employers, then they are taking care of us and should have more of a vested interest in making sure that their employees have their well-being, have fulfillment, have safety. But that is not the culture in which we live. And the job of influencing and the glorification of quitting your 9-to-5 to become a contracted self-employed influencer is not adding anything positive or constructive or critical to that conversation. At least not what I've seen. Maybe there are examples out there that negate this totally. I would love to know that. I would love to feel as if we're waking up in that regard. And again, I'm not saying that I believe employers should be our parents in that regard and want to take care of us and provide for us and all that. I'm just saying that within the context of our society, you need to have money to afford to live. You need to have money to have a house, to have an apartment, to buy food at the grocery store. If you grow all your own food and own your house or built your own house and have property or whatever it is, you're exempt from the system, then, perhaps that's more of an ideal scenario. I do believe that, the braiding sweetgrass scenario of not having to exchange labor for money for food, like putting the labor in to grow your food directly is perhaps getting straight to the source. Not everybody can do that, and it's perhaps not the most economic way to live in terms of energy for payoff, right? Like, I'm not making an argument to go back before agricultural times, but it is something to think about in terms of how we operate within our society and in terms of what being paid a salary actually means, if that is our livelihood. Anyway, let's get out of the realms of intense overthinking and get back to my script here. Influencers are a powerful an authentic marketing tool in the arsenal of tools that capital owners have to take advantage of and promote their products. And here I'm not really talking about the small business taking advantage of social media platforms to try to get word about their products out there, although the mechanisms might be the same. And to some extent, I'm not even talking about people genuinely mentioning the things that they love and use. Although, like I said, these things are inevitably operating within the same system. I'm mainly talking about the corporations with the money and the power to shape the fabric of society, to saturate social media platforms with multiple mentions of their products. The ability to inundate our feeds with fleets of influencers who've all been paid to talk positively about something at the same time so that nobody escapes from the web of the marketing. No demographic remains untouched through this campaign of sponsorships or PR. And I also think the difference here is in that influencers tend to make a career out of some degree of relatability. And at the end of the day, they have some degree of choice in what they accept or decline. What they align themselves with in terms of their brand and the company's brands. And therefore, there is some underlying onus to try to keep their brand aligned and exercise their right of choice, even if it's just in discerning which products to talk about. And then the steps can go further in terms of discerning how much critical thinking to allow into their platforms or to not allow this critical thinking into the platforms. It's all kind of choice-based. And again, the choice is complex because of this operation within a system where we depend on earning money to sustain our livelihoods. So getting into some direct examples here, when we take the realistic example, maybe the most realistic example of non-wealthy influencers showcasing their stuff. Even these non-wealthy influencers are still making it their jobs to center their lives around consumerism, aspirational consumerism especially. And it's content like this, the regular people who don't present as wealthy, who don't appear to have necessarily reached the level of brand trips and designer everything. It is this content that is often the most dangerous. It is this content that normalizes the thought of me having 30 pairs of shoes not being that bad because Sally down the road on TikTok has 100, or me having 12 purses not being that bad because so-and-so on TikTok has a few designer bags that cost thousands of dollars for just one. And it's not necessarily that this person on TikTok has generational wealth, but it's that they're a regular person like me who has just worked hard and earned money and therefore bought all these luxurious things. Made it normal to buy these luxurious things when you earn that amount of money, regardless of whether it's through influencing or not. They're participating in cultivating the comparison trap and leveling it up with each level that they climb. And I think the difference between influencers and regular people who also engage in this comparison leveling up is that influencers choose to make it as public as possible, or choose to share on a platform that can be seen by everybody all over the world. And it's one thing to do it in our own neighborhoods, in our own social circles, where we know the people we're interacting with, we know what judgments they might make or how they might feel. If I show up to work with a new designer bag with a blatant logo or a Gucci belt or, whatever, a lot of people won't know what it is, but the people who do know might judge me, and I have some awareness of what it might look like to this person. If it looks like I've suddenly come into a lot of money, I have some awareness of the direct interactions in my life. Influencers do not. They operate on platforms where the people seeing them may be young and impressionable, and they may not have critical thinking fully developed. They may actually be non-adults. You might be marketing towards children inadvertently. You might be marketing to people in the global south who are seeing this content and looking at the fruits of their labor in some cases. They might be working in factories that produce these so-called designer goods and see how you're presenting it. You might be, you don't know who's on the other end. You're not speaking directly or interacting directly with the people. And that in itself is a problem. And then when we choose to do that and focus on consumerism devoid of critical thinking, when we choose to normalize the vast quantities of stuff, basically it's just the practice of centering consumerism in our lives that becomes acceptable through this kind of content and relatable through this kind of content. It is in some ways perpetuating all of the worst parts of capitalism. The exploiting people who may not need these things but are now driven to want these things. The exploiting the people who make these things, and in the interests of funneling some of that wealth through their labor that they didn't earn, trickling it down through another sieve, I guess, before it gets to the people who actually produce the products. It's just all of the worst parts of an exploitative system amplified, and all of the maybe more harmful narratives of society, the lies I used to believe, I guess, that are perpetuated in this type of content. Speaking briefly of the lifestyle of the genuinely wealthy in comparison to this, is that when we see these examples in front of our eyeballs online, when we normally wouldn't be exposed to this in our real lives, we can start to think that if we attain the stuff that they have, that we will also get that life. And for most of us, attaining the same bag as a wealthy influencer online is not going to bring our lives remotely closer to theirs. We don't have the generational wealth, we don't have the resources, we don't have the background, we don't have the connections, we don't have anything that they really have. And by presenting their life alongside certain stuff, sometimes with their direct endorsement through sponsorships or PR, we start to imagine that we get closer to that through the actual consumption of the goods. And again, this is not something that we have full control over. It is part of our psychology. I've read books kind of dedicated to this mimetic desire of seeing it and wanting it, especially if we see it on somebody aspirational to us. And being secure and safe and having enough money is aspirational, point blank. Again, in a society where we have to work to afford basic needs like food and medical care, it is aspirational to have enough money to not have to worry about those things. As Grace Blakely puts it directly in Vulture Capitalism, some people have to work in order to afford their living, with the alternative being destitute and starving, and other people don't. It's a fundamentally unequal playing field, and it can be both dangerous and depressing to associate the acquisition of stuff with actual capital ownership, the status symbols with the actual status. Basically, influencers definitely aren't going to be the radical people that inspire us to think critically about our own possible choices, or help us see these systems of oppression and break free as a collective. And I would argue that, in fact, they function to do the opposite, to keep us in it, to keep us from questioning, to keep us running after the wrong things. Normalizing overconsumption, aspiring towards more and more money and more stuff, fixing everything with a purchase, and perpetuating individual freedoms, and often framing it as correct or right to consume the way we want to, because we want to, or even stating that they consume the way they do because it is their job to do so. But they have chosen to make a job out of focusing on stuff, consuming stuff, and honestly, the fact that there has to be a justification for it at all signals that something is deeply wrong with it, the consumption of stuff at this rate. The fact that influencers have chosen to be a cog in this machine feels also as if it dilutes the efforts of those of us on this platform trying to speak out against it. And by it, I mean overconsumption. It feels like it dilutes the whole positive effects of social media as an entire platform, honestly. And again, the blame is not entirely on the influencers who are performing an available job to earn a living. And it's not as if one person's sacrifice, if one person chooses not to be an influencer, that's not going to cut it. It's not going to inspire social reform. Even one mega CEO who vocally opposes the status quo and doesn't take a huge salary may have a small impact and may receive coverage for being contrary to public expectation or convention, but it probably won't change the system or start a movement, and it probably will be violently opposed or explained why that's not normal or doable by all the other CEOs in that position, the people who would prefer to keep the status quo and their billionaire status in the status quo. Not to mention they'd probably also pay a lot to ensure that such a movement doesn't take hold, and they have the power to do things like that. I'm still at a loss, honestly, as to how to participate in the system myself. I've already shared on here that I do feel like I've had to cut off most of my participation in short-form social media, especially. And I've been trying to stringently manage my own habits of personal consumption, shopping through no-buy challenges. But I don't want to isolate myself from the people. I don't want to not engage with the news for fear of misinformation or being advertised to and preyed on. And even if content like mine isn't motivated by making money directly, it is on a platform where the motivation is to make money directly. So regardless of whether I optimize, YouTube is optimizing in order to make money off of what I contribute to this platform. There's almost no way to escape this possible exposure to these patently false narratives of marketing. It's also an extremely unfortunate reality that the fallout of all these examples of overconsumption, the biggest impact is on our planet and our living conditions. We can't do all of this in a vacuum. Microplastics are found in all of our bodies now. Our food supplies, the ocean, the pollution is everywhere and having an impact on all of us, having an impact on our climate. And this is an impact that literally nobody can escape from. Maybe the richest among us can escape temporarily in bunkers or find ways to grow uncontaminated food and live in insulation from the rest of the world. But what kind of a life can that be, isolated from the rest of life? And obviously that's not a sustainable or realistic aspiration for any of the rest of us out there. I actually do think perhaps the most harmful aspect of influencing is the perpetuation that things like the restocks, the hauls, the organization, the focus on stuff, the centering of consumerism is a normal way to operate, if not the normal way. I am encouraged by the presence of comments on videos that show blatant overconsumption, acknowledging the overconsumption and acknowledging the harm to our planet. So it's not necessarily accepted as the way to be, and those people leaving the comments against this type of content are exercising their critical thinking, hopefully. In some cases, the comments are like, overconsumption final boss, but I love it. So it's got this kind of dichotomy on display, that's within us all about how it's overconsumption, we know it's bad, but at the same time, it's not good, but aspirational still, something that we desire, something that we covet for ourselves. It's just navigating these tensions of being human are not made any easier by the career of product influencing. There's a lot of myths that are perpetuated by the career of influencing, not just about stuff, not just about normalized quantity of stuff, but also about what kind of jobs are aspirational, what kind of life is aspirational. And I just think that it's dangerous at the very least, if not negative for our society to be exposed to these narratives as often as we can be if we spend time being exposed to influencer content. And finally, the presence of this content is directing the presence of our attention. And that can be damaging as well, or it can be dangerous. It can be good, but it can also be bad, just like anything else that I'm discussing in this video, or on this channel at large. I think it was Mark Insco who did a video about rage bait and the recent ads. I had this video on the list of videos that inspire me, and I think I referred to this idea in an earlier video where brands are at a point where any attention is good and any exposure puts them into the minds of consumers, wider and wider audiences. And so in the same way, what influencers showcase and what they get views for is directing our attention, is exposing larger and larger amounts of people. Everybody who sees their video, everybody who sees my video is exposed to all of my stuff, and I realized that I forgot to take this down for this series of filming. So you've all seen, for the last few videos probably, my purse with one of my Labubus on it. Yikes. So exposure in action. And like I said, even before I noticed that, I'm guilty of this. I'm guilty of spotlighting brands and getting them into the minds of my viewers. I had some comments on the video I did about ThredUp. How some of the people who saw me saying that I was sending stuff to ThredUp were either considering or had sent stuff to ThredUp as well, and had similarly negative experiences. And I wasn't even thinking about that when I shared that I was doing that. But my actions had a ripple effect, even a small one. And it's, again, so tricky to navigate, so tricky to know how to participate in the system with the least negative effects possible. And I just don't know if influencers, the bona fide influencers, I looked up the pronunciation of that one time and I've already forgotten how to say it. But I just don't know that they think very much about that kind of impact, or their content certainly doesn't reflect a depth of thought about that kind of impact. Or perhaps they've decided that the negative aspects of that kind of impact are worth their personal benefits of earning their livelihood that way. And it doesn't even take a PR or sponsored content post to do this. Anytime anybody shows anything on the internet is exposure for that thing. It is a direction of our attention at large as a collective to whatever is being presented. And we can control our perception of it. We can control what we choose to watch, but the more presence of these kind of stuff-focused videos, the more likely that we will come across them and have to direct ourselves, have to use our mental energy avoiding them. And again, it just creates this dynamic. It's not any one person's fault, or it's not totally out of the control of the viewer, but it is a systemic issue that is only being made worse by increased presence of sponsored content, PR, influencing in general. Online, devoid from the connection between influencer and influencee, that community connection. I think that's a good enough conclusion for what I've said in this video as any. So I will wrap it up here. Again, if you would like to have a more eloquent and researched version of kind of all the problems of influencing in perhaps a less direct way, Vulture Capitalism was a great resource for me. You might be interested in reading it as well. Grace Blakely doesn't necessarily talk about influencers in that book, but what she did divulge about the system of capitalism when applied to careers like influencing kind of really highlights the perpetuation of harmful narratives of society in that type of content. And, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about how influencing online didn't really exist a couple of decades ago. And it really has become this kind of chunk of the pie chart of humanity that has all kinds of positive and negative implications, and has also gone largely unregulated since it is such a new sector of business, which is both good and bad for people who influence and companies who make use of influencers. Anyway, that's my video about how influencers are unethical, or the problem with influencers, or an unfiltered ramble about how influencers have impacted society or what they can do and our response to them and how we can respond. And I've probably missed a bunch of things, and I have definitely neglected some of my own script here because the flow of the video is just kind of going in all kinds of directions. But let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts on influencers, the problem with influencers, how you interact with influencers, what your kind of context and criteria is as far as what you consume online, what you willingly consume, what you try to avoid consuming, whether you enjoy content focused around consumerism as a source of entertainment, which I think is kind of damaging in itself, but I'm not going to address that in today's video. Let me know everything. I will say bye for now and see you in the next one.